Welcome to the podcast Blind Faith, a podcast exploring how blindness and faith sort of collide and work together. My name is Mark Madavan, and it's my privilege to host this podcast brought to you by Torch Trust for the Blind. In each episode, I'm chatting with a different person who has encountered blindness or experiences blindness, and we're just exploring that and their faith. My guest today is Ife Akintunde. Really warm welcome to you.
Hey, thank you very much, brother.
And I want to dive straight in. So, Ife, what is your experience with blindness?
Well, I was born with a little sight, not very much. I could play football with my friends. But this is really interesting because there was no history of blindness in my family. So my family were totally unaware of what it was. I have an elder sister and she was okay. And then they suddenly found that, I wasn't responding as I would normally respond. And so the question then became, there was a civil war in Nigeria at that time, 1967. And the question was how to deal with this. We're a fairly sort of middle class family. My dad's a civil engineer, my mom's a nurse. But despite that, we had no experience of what to do and which hospital to go. My mom worked in a hospital, so that resolved the hospital bit. But generally, there was no real experience of what to do, even which school to go.
Wow. So to pardon the pun, but you're really groping in the dark to try to work out how to deal with this.
That's an interesting thing to say, but it was true, yeah.
Yeah. So you said a second ago that you played football and things. So did you had some sight, but obviously it was restricted, and that's what triggered off the understanding there was something wrong?
Yeah, I had some sight, but that sight started to go later on.
Okay.
But when I was young, I was playing football. I didn't play very well. I mean, my sighted friends enjoyed pulling the ball around me and making me kick the air, but
Yeah.
it was fun.
Yeah. It's thoughtlessness, but fun thoughtlessness, as kids do. Yeah.
Yes.
So as you grew up in Nigeria, and did you eventually find some connection with your sight loss and some reason behind it?
I think it must have been I was about 31 years old when I eventually got to Moorfield and they gave it a name. But before then, everyone kept looking. My dad actually was in Newcastle when I was about 4 or 5, and I came to Newcastle during the summer, and we saw an ophthalmologist, and they didn't know what to do. So they advised me to just go to a school, um, which was just one of these other schools that my other friends were going to, and I did, and I couldn't cope. And then someone told us about this school for blind people called Pacheli in Lagos. It was a Catholic school run by Irish sisters, and I gather it was named after Pope Pius Pacheli, if that was his name. And so I went there just before I turned 6, and that was my first experience of going into a school for blind people.
And did you find bit surrounded by other folks who actually understood what you were facing as a daily life? Did that give? How did that impact how you're thinking? Or you're 6, you probably weren't thinking much anyway.
Well, it changed things in many ways. The truth is that the culture around disability in Nigeria is such that people tended to keep their disabled children away and keep them indoors and hide them away. My parents weren't like that, so I went to Pacheli already as I think strangely enough I could speak English when I went to Pacheli, but that wasn't the case with many of the other students. And I also found I was the youngest in the class because a lot of people didn't think to send their children to school until they were 9 or 10 years old. Um, and people then came and told them, your child can actually go to school. I also found that I was pretty, a lot of the people who were in that school were also not very, it was an equalizer, that kind of school. So it catered to every kind of person, rich, poor, whatever. The fees were very affordable to make sure that anyone could attend it. So in one sense, the school itself was a very classless school, I suppose is the best way to put it. And that means I got to meet people of all kinds of backgrounds and from all over the country as well. And one of the things about Nigeria, which you may not know, is that Nigeria has several ethnic groups, about 300, 400 ethnic groups, people speaking different languages. But because there were very few schools, we all kind of congregated in Pacheli School in Lagos. So I was meeting people who perhaps didn't speak English, but were speaking a completely different language from me, and we all learned together.
So that was interesting. So you had the commonality of your sight loss, but actually different languages and learning together must have been interesting.
No, it
How
was.
how long were you in that school?
I was there until I turned until just before I got to my 11th birthday. Then I went to a really good school actually, King's College in Lagos, which was I found out later it was built by the colonial administration to raise civil servants for the country before independence. But it was the kind of school that they taught us. So it was because it was meant to train civil servants. We were kind of taught all the I don't know, I suppose we're taught English style education and up to a very high standard as well. But I was one of only about 5 or 6 blind students in the school. And fortunately, from Pacelli School, I'd been taught to use a typewriter. In fact, I once said to someone that I got my typing certificate when I was 9. So if you'd wanted to employ me as a clerk or something at 9 years old,
Amazing.
no one did,
Oh no, I
sadly.
said.
I'd have made some money. I was qualified. So when I got to King's College, I was able to type my work for teachers and use Braille to read notes and text and stuff.
And then after school, what happened? Where did you go to
I
work?
went
Employment?
to University of Lagos and studied law. This was where differences started to show up because by the time I got to the University of Lagos, I found that although there were blind students studying law in other universities, I was actually the first to be admitted into the University of Lagos to study law. There were blind students studying other courses, I think education and stuff like that, but I was the first to study law. So it was a really interesting scenario because you had this class of this many people, 200, 300, or whatever, and I was one of them. And I had to take my notes with my Perkins Brailler, which was quite noisy actually. Um, and so you'd hear the lecturer talking, and I'd be taking notes because I didn't like using cassettes. And but the class was big enough to absorb the noise of my Perkins Brailler, and it worked.
I mean, that's amazing. I mean, I'm registered blind as well, but mine's been more of a gradual. So when I was in my education, I had enough sight to blend in, as it were. Whenever I hear stories like yourselves, is I'm always really impressed and a little bit intimidated and going, blimey, how do they do that? And how, just that is it a confidence thing? Is it just a necessity thing?
No, it's my theory is it's a thing you learn because you're young, and when you're young, you can do anything. Really, you can cope much easily. I mean, a lot of my best friends are friends I made when I was 5 or 6 when we played football together because we just could do it. And if they said, "Oh well, the way to do your notes is to get a braille writer and braille it," then you'd braille it. You wouldn't think twice about doing it because you're young. There are lots of things that I used to do then that I would struggle to do now. I mean, learning new routes, for example, I don't think I'm as good at learning new routes now as I was when I was 2021.
Okay, in a weird way, this encourages me because me and probably other listeners here are more mature than the early teens, and saying because I get that when you're young you sort of know no difference and you just dive in and do it.
Yeah.
Now we're older and sensible and more cautious and whatever, it gets a bit more challenging. So in a weird way, I'm encouraged that you find it harder now.
Well, I do. A friend of mine first said to me, she said, try not to fall because when your bones break, they don't heal as easily as when you were young. So I try not to fall this time.
Well, that's probably good advice.
Very good advice.
What has surprised you or stretched you in a surprising way regarding your blindness?
I call it something about the disillusion of recognizing that your work opportunities aren't the same as your friends. So I went into a secondary school and I went and I did law with my classmates, and I was the only blind person. And I was expecting to be in Nigeria. A King's Council in Nigeria is called the Senior Advocate of Nigeria. So when I was doing my university studies, I was thinking of myself as one of the others that, one day I'd be standing in front of a judge going, Your Honor, I'm the Senior Advocate of Nigeria. And that didn't happen
Mm.
because there was a really interesting story when I met a lawyer once when I was strolling to a friend's house. He said, What am I studying? I said, Law. Oh, I'm a lawyer as well. And he took me to court. And I was so like, um, he became like a hero to me because he looked like a kind of a mentor. And then when I was at the law school, so they said to me, "You need to go and do 10 weeks of law practice." So I called this gentleman because I thought, "This is my hero; he'll have me." And I said, "Oh, I've been told to do 10 weeks. Can I do this with you?" And he said, "No." And I think that was the first time I realized that blindness might actually impede my ability to get what I wanted, whatever job I wanted. And he explained to me that it was better I go to somebody who would employ me to make a political point because he couldn't. And the lawyer he recommended, strangely enough, was someone who was well known to my family, because we're from the same hometown, and he's kind of a Nigerian constitutional lawyer of repute. And I know he knew my dad, but I didn't go to this guy. I went to the person I considered to be my hero. It was a bit of a like, so this is what it's like to be in the world of work type scenario. No one's gonna want you.
Yeah, and I think that's it. There's, to me, there's that tension between trying to be encouraged that you can do a lot of stuff and you really can go on, but also the reality is that that may not be other people's opinion, and it's how do you how do you deal with that when you face it?
Yes.
So how did you deal with that when you faced it?
I ended up moving away from law actually. When I came to Lancaster, I came to study international relations because by the time I'd finished my law studies, I'd come to the conclusion that I'd never be able to practice law. There was no practicing lawyer in Nigeria. And I thought, if you do international relations, because I liked the BBC and I was always listening to the news, I thought you wouldn't need to struggle to find books. When you're answering a question, just remember what you heard in the news, and that would be you could use that to answer any to practicalize any theoretical question, if you see what I mean.
Mm.
So I came to Lancaster to study international relations instead of law. And that was my way of coping with the fact that I might struggle with all the reading that was involved in law and getting familiar with the case law and all that kind of stuff. Um, I picked I came to do my master's in 1990, and that was a very significant year because it was the year Iraq invaded Kuwait. And when I was doing my master's, my dissertation, I just said, I just picked that as my topic. It surprised many people because they thought I'd be working on something African, but this was what was in the news. I didn't have to struggle. All I had to do was, oh, what did they say in the news yesterday about the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait? And I did very well in my dissertation. And I then carried on with the doctorate in that area just for the same reason.
That's amazing. And I mean, what I'm picking up from what you just said, so please correct me if I'm stating this not right, is because as you are progressing, you're going to bump into situations that the reality of other people, and you think I just can't do what I thought, and you just like shifted lanes. You thought it's not going to stop me. I just have to redirect it in a way that I can engage with.
Yes, that's exactly what it was. They now call it coping mechanisms or something
Yes.
like that.
And I think that's you're a doctor. I didn't realize you're a doctor. So sorry about that, doctor. And but I
Thank you.
yeah, it is many of us think, well, I'm never going to be up to that doctorate level and do that. But I think some of that principle is the same because just in our everyday lives, we're going to find some things that you're going, oh, I can't do that. And it may be just from neighbors or in a church situation or a work situation, and you get a brick wall, you can't do it. As opposed to going, oh, that's the end of the game, I'm going to pack up and leave. It's how do we find another route?
The other thing for me to tell the truth is I really believe that God was in my even in my PhD. I started to do it at a time when the internet started to pick up and you could get so I was working on the United Nations and Iraq, and I realized then that a lot of the reports I needed were on the United Nations website. So I had that kind of primary information that imagine if I had to be going to libraries and picking out all those books and getting people to read to me. So it was almost like I started to study at the right time for the internet and many other things. Everything just kind of
Yeah,
fitted in.
that's amazing. And you just said that you felt it was a God directive or God intervention in that way in helping. So where does
Timing.
So, but where does faith fit in? You drop God in, and you're saying, okay, well, I'm sure that's not the first time you thought of God. So, how does faith and God fit into your story, your journey?
It's really interesting because so when I was in Pacelli school, it was a Catholic school, and my parents went to an Anglican church, and so I had heard of God enough to be interested. But I had these friends who were saying to me I wasn't a Christian when I went into my secondary school, and I was like, "What do you mean? I go to church? We used to wake up at 5:30 for mass every morning. I mean, Monday to Friday. How can you tell me I'm not a Christian?" And they were like, "No, you're not." "Yes, I am." And we had this debate, and eventually they won. And when they won, there was an interesting scenario because one of the things they said to me was, if we pray for you, you'll be able to see. And we're about 12 or 13, and we used to pray late into the night, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, and I couldn't see. And that created another um, kind of crisis of faith. And by the time I got to my university, I wasn't a practicing Christian. But even in that, God was very clearly present. So I had a friend, and we're friends from secondary school, found ourselves in the same universities. An excellent keyboardist he was. And he set up an organization. He called that the Full Measure Christian Organization. And he had a theory. He said, where it says full measure pressed down, taken, shaken together, and running over.
Yeah.
He said that God gave us the full measure of his love and that we ought to give him back the full measure of everything, talent, everything. And he actually wrote a song about it. He was a musician. And so we became friends, but that didn't work. And I had a lot of my classmates who would read to me in the day and pray for me at night, and I would argue with them. And you know how it is, lawyers like intellectual pursuits. So I was very interested in arguing Christianity with them. And a lot of them are surprised now that I found God in the end, or God found me, because what then happened was two events took place. One of them was that I once woke up one morning. I told you about listening to the BBC, and I was getting ready to go to law school, which is sort of like one of those things you do for a year when you finish law at the university in order to be able to practice in Nigeria. And I said, I'd listen to the BBC World Service on one of those shortwave radios that squeak a lot. So I was squeaking my way to the BBC World Service, and I found a station called Family Radio. And the day before, I'd just been thinking, perhaps the reason I don't understand this Christianity thing is because I don't have that many portions of the Bible with me, maybe just about 5 or 6 volumes I'd used for an exam in secondary school. I said, maybe if I knew more of the Bible, I might understand what they were saying. So I wake up that morning, and I'm squeaking my way to the BBC World Service, and I meet Family Radio. And as I got there, they were saying, now we will do our Bible reading for the day. And I remember that morning not saying to myself, I didn't even pray for it. It was just like I thought about it, fell asleep, wake up, turn on the radio, Bible reading. And so that morning, and until I finished the law school, at about 7 o'clock every morning, I would listen to the Bible reading for the day. And I just thought of it as God trying to answer that prayer. But the other thing was, you remember those cassettes, those little rectangular cassettes? When I was leaving for the university, when I was leaving for um, Lancaster, it was, one of my aunties gave me a box of the New Testament on cassette. Now, this is really interesting because at that point I was thinking my 5 volumes were not, they would be too big to travel. And so I'll just go without my Bibles. And the other thing was, I'd won a prize at the Nigerian Law School. And when you win a prize, they would give you a book or something. But they had given me a cassette recorder. So I win a cassette recorder prize, and I get a box of New Testament tapes. And I came into Lancaster University, and I didn't know anyone. I was just sitting there in my room, and I thought, well, you're sitting there and I don't like just being alone and bored. So what would you do? I brought out the cassettes and I started to listen to them. And I started to listen to Paul's letters. And finally, I started to understand about faith and grace and things like that. And I was like, wow. this is what those students meant all that time, So this is what grace was. This is what faith was. And then I understood better and maybe rededicated my life to Jesus Christ.
It's amazing. I think, God is much more, perseveres with us much more than I think we think. God's
Oh
around you
yes,
and has you.
absolutely.
And I'm also just intrigued that, because you said, in your early teens, as you're talking about faith and blindness and stuff, but when it came to the real, do you believe in Jesus and do you put your heart in it? Blindness has nothing to do with it. It's a hard thing.
It's a hard thing. I learned later on that passage in John chapter 9 when we talk about, when the disciples asked Jesus, they said, well, why was this person blind? Was it because of the sin of the father or the sin of the mother? Jesus Christ said, no, it's that the works of God will be made manifest in his life. And I realized, and I think I wrote about this in one of my articles, that actually the test of disability isn't whether you're blind, is actually whether God's works are made manifest in your life. And that's kind of became my watchword rather than that became how I would understand whether I was disabled or not. I feel that
Yeah.
the more God is manifest in your life, the less disabled you are.
I think that's really interesting. I think the higher reality or higher truth or higher thing is, can you see Christ in you?
Yeah,
Not am I fully abled, whatever that means. And that's fine.
exactly.
We're just coming to the end of the podcast. It's been brilliant hearing your story, and I'm fascinated. And I know this podcast brought by Torch Trust, because you got connected with Torch Trust in Africa. Is that right?
Oh yeah. Yeah, I told you about the school I was attended as primary school was a school for blind people. So we used to get these little books called Torch, and they used to come to us every kind of 2 or 3 months, and I used to read them. I don't know how much they meant to me, but I read them. And when I left, I gave them my address in my home address, and they used to send them to me. So I was very familiar with the work of Torch, and I really used to kind of get in touch with everything they were doing. And a lot of the things that they did were interesting because I like reading stories. Everyone thinks I've got a doctorate and I should read big theoretical stuff. I just love fiction. And they would make Bible stories come alive. They would tell me about what people were doing in various African countries. There were pen friends, there were things. There were things that I really just liked. So I just liked the work of Torch and I liked the magazines that they produced. And I just carried on.
And it's great that Torch Trust is still continuing to try to reach in different ways, and basically to help people along their journey and support them and encourage people to get in touch with Torch Trust and to find that out.
Absolutely.
My final question, and it will be a really quickie, is if you were to meet your younger self in your late teens, early 20s, so and you're able to be, the old you is going back to the young you, what bit of advice would you say to yourself?
This is hard um, to know that God's working, but He is.
I think that's a really powerful thing, is even though you can't see God is working, he is. That's really good. It's been a delight to just do the chat and hear some of your story, and just want to thank you for coming, and thank you for listening, and I hope people will tune in the next podcast.
If you are living with sight loss or support someone who is, then Torch is here for you. Get in touch at torchtrust.org.